June 14, 1942. The skies over northern France tremble with the roar of engines. Over the radio, a German fighter pilot lets out a mocking laugh. Another flight of Black Widows, coming straight to their funeral. The Martin B-26 Marauder was a joke to them. A cursed machine, they said. An accident waiting to happen. American crews whispered its nickname with dread, the Widowmaker. Its early record was brutal. Too many crashes on takeoff, too many training deaths, too many young men sent to their graves before even meeting the enemy. For the Luftwaffe, this wasn't a threat. It was sport. Now, imagine yourself strapped into the cockpit of a Marauder. The cabin rattles like a steel drum. The stench of burnt oil seeps into your lungs. Anti-aircraft shells blossom around you, shaking the fuselage like a rag doll. You glance at the bombardier, his jaw clenched, sweat dripping down his goggles. Every nerve in your body screams, wrong plane, wrong war. Yet here's the paradox. Mission after mission, despite its cursed beginning, the Marauder didn't fade into the graveyard of bad designs. It sharpened. It adapted. And eventually, it became the most accurate bomber in the entire U.S. arsenal. Oh. How does a machine despised by its own pilots rise from the ashes of ridicule? Was it better training? Smarter tactics? A tweak in engineering? Or was it sheer stubbornness, the kind that turns mockery into terror? By 1944, German pilots no longer laughed when they saw the Marauder on radar. They braced for impact. Because by then, the Widowmaker had transformed into a scalpel, cutting with precision across Europe's skies. In this documentary, we'll retrace the Marauder's improbable journey, from black sheep of the bomber corps to unsung hero of Allied air power. You'll hear voices from the diaries of men who flew her, who cursed her, and who ultimately trusted her with their lives. You'll see how German arrogance clashed with American determination. And we'll explore alternate histories too. What if the U.S. Army Air Forces had abandoned the Marauder in 1942? Would the bombing campaign over Europe have faltered, or found another way? This is not just about rivets, engines, or payload statistics. This is about hubris. About how easy it is to laugh at what you don't understand, until it starts punching back. So if you thought the Marauder was just another footnote in aviation history, stay with me. By the end, you'll see why the plane once mocked as a flying coffin earned a different reputation, the most accurate bomber of World War II. And if you want more stories like this, cinematic dives into the weapons, the men, and the myths of history, hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, and join this channel. Because here, every forgotten machine still has a story worth telling. June 1942, Northern France. The Luftwaffe still owned the skies. German pilots strutted with a kind of arrogance only victory can fuel. Their Messerschmitt Bf 109s were swift, their Focke-Wulfs brutal. To them, American bombers were slow-moving targets, flying piñatas stuffed with gasoline. And among those targets, none seemed more laughable than the Martin B-26 Marauder. With its short, stubby wings and high landing speed, it was infamous even before combat. The Widowmaker, the Americans themselves whispered. German pilots picked up on that nickname like wolves scenting blood. They called it Die Widowmaker, das Geschenk der Feinde, the Widowmaker, the enemy's gift. The Marauder's baptism of fire came over occupied France in low-level attacks against heavily defended rail yards and airfields. These were not the high-altitude raids of the B-17s. Marauders had to swoop in closer, skimming treetops, braving walls of flak. To German gunners it felt like target practice. Early losses confirmed their contempt. Marauders fell in flames before reaching their targets, engines coughing, wings snapping under stress. But here's the cinematic irony. Even in those disastrous first raids, some bombs hit exactly where intended. A Luftwaffe colonel, writing in his diary after a July 1942 raid near Abbeville, confessed, "The Americans are fools to send this cursed plane. Yet the rails are gone. Our supply trains delayed. Perhaps the fool carries a sharper knife than he knows." That sharper knife was precision. The Marauder, despite its flaws, had a gift. When it survived the gauntlet, it delivered its bombs with uncanny accuracy. Crews began learning how to handle the beast, how to coax its speed into advantage, how to dive into a run and level out at just the right second. German soldiers who had scoffed at its silhouette now watched in horror as bridges, fuel depots, and hangars vanished in perfectly placed explosions. One mission in August 1942 targeted a Luftwaffe airfield at IJmuiden, Holland. A formation of marauders stormed in low, flak exploding around them. The Germans joked over radio chatter, "Here come the coffins." But then the runway disappeared in a sheet of fire. Hangars collapsed like paper. A row of parked fighters went up in flames before even leaving the ground. Out of 20 marauders, 15 returned, a loss rate, yes, but the destruction was undeniable. An RAF observer attached to the raid wrote later, "They came in like clumsy bulls. But when the dust cleared, there was nothing left to fly. Perhaps the bull has horns sharper than we guessed." The shift was subtle at first. German pilots still laughed, still called it the Widowmaker. But in the quiet of their debriefing rooms, another word crept in, precise. Precise. They could no longer deny the fact. The Marauder might kill its own crews in training, but when it reached its target, it killed with surgical precision. By late 1942, the Marauder was redeployed for missions in North Africa. Over Tunisia, the Luftwaffe's contempt would be tested again. German pilots expected easy prey in desert skies. But now Marauder crews were seasoned. They learned to fly in tight formations interlocking fields of defensive fire. Fighters diving on them suddenly found themselves shredded by .50 caliber streams from multiple angles. One German ace, Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Schmid, later admitted, "The Marauder was not beautiful, not graceful. But it was fast, too fast sometimes to catch, and if you stayed too long on its tail, its teeth would tear you apart." Speed was the Marauder's hidden strength. With powerful Pratt & Whitney R2800 engines, it could outrun many interceptors once it dropped its bombs. The Luftwaffe, once amused, began filing urgent memos. Avoid prolonged engagements with B-26 formations. Losses unsustainable. That was the turning point. What began as ridicule transformed into respect, then into fear. By early 1943, Luftwaffe crews whispered a different warning. The Widowmaker does not only kill its pilots. It kills us too. And perhaps most haunting for the Germans, the accuracy only improved. Bridges in Tunisia vanished with pinpoint strikes. Supply depots detonated in spectacular infernos. Convoys were obliterated with fewer sorties. The Marauder was proving that precision could cripple an enemy more effectively than brute force. As one Allied general put it, the Marauder does not scatter bombs. It signs its name on the target. By the end of the North Africa campaign, German arrogance was cracked. The Marauder was no longer a laughingstock. It was a predator, one that the Luftwaffe had to acknowledge. And this was only the beginning. Because soon, over Sicily, Italy, and later the very heart of France, the Marauder would stop being the butt of a joke and start becoming the punctuation mark, the final period, on Germany's dream of domination. July 1943. The Mediterranean night is thick with salt air and static over the radio. Off the coast of Sicily, German anti-aircraft crews prepare for yet another raid. They laugh bitterly, wagering cigarettes on how many Widowmakers will crash before even reaching shore. For the Wehrmacht, this was easy money. The invasion of Sicily was about to put the Marauder on center stage. By now, American crews had endured the hard lessons of 1942. They knew the quirks of their short-winged beast, knew how to tame its furious takeoff speed, knew how to weld their formation into a moving fortress. What the Germans dismissed as chaos was becoming choreography. At dawn on July 10, waves of Marauders roared across the Sicilian coast. From above, they still looked ungainly, stubby wings, blunt noses, a bomber that seemed to waddle through the sky. Luftwaffe observers jeered, "Der fliegende Sarg," the flying coffin. But their laughter froze as the first bomb lines fell. The accuracy was chilling. A rail junction at Catania vanished in fire, severing Axis supply lines in a single strike. Fuel depots erupted in chain explosions, flames leaping higher than the olive groves. German infantry, hardened by years of victories, broke into panicked retreat as entire columns were pinned down by surgical strikes. One Wehrmacht officer later admitted in a private report, "They fly like cattle, but they strike like surgeons. We underestimated the Marauder." The transformation was undeniable. Luftwaffe pilots, once eager to hunt Marauders, now found themselves cornered. The B-26's speed gave it a cruel advantage, fast enough to close on a target, faster still once its bomb bay was empty. Fighters that lingered too long behind a formation were chewed apart by synchronized defensive fire. The Marauder had become a wolf pack in the sky. In one Sicilian raid, Oberfeldwebel Hans Mertens dove his Messerschmitt into a B-26 formation, confident in an easy kill. Within seconds, his cockpit was shredded by converging streams of .50 caliber fire. His wingman pulled up in terror, later writing in his diary, "It is no longer a coffin. It is a trap." The campaign in Sicily revealed another secret: the Marauder's uncanny ability to demolish bridges with almost mathematical precision. German engineers would repair a crossing overnight, only to see it vanish the next morning under a fresh wave of bombs. Entire divisions stalled, armor immobilized, supply trucks stranded. The Marauder was not just killing men, it was strangling an army. By the time the Allies pushed into mainland Italy, the Marauder had become a nightmare for the Axis. Missions against Naples, Foggia, and Rome showcased its terrifying efficiency. A German staff officer noted after a December 1943 raid, "Their bombs fall as if guided. Our convoys are slaughtered before they reach the front. This is not war, it is execution." Execution. That word echoed in Luftwaffe briefings. What had been mockery turned to grim respect. Pilots who once smirked at the Widowmaker now warned each other, "Do not underestimate the Marauder. It is precise. It is fast. It is deadly." Even Hermann Göring, ever the blusterer, could not ignore the reports. In one infamous meeting when a junior officer laughed at American bombers, Göring slammed his fist on the table, "Laugh if you like. But those Marauders cut my bridges faster than I can build them. Do you call that funny?" The shift in morale was palpable. German ground troops, once cheered by the sight of a Marauder spiraling down in flames, now prayed they would not hear the thunder of its engines overhead. Soldiers gave it a new name, Der Henker, the executioner. And the statistics bore out the terror. By early 1944, the Marauder boasted the lowest loss rate of any Allied bomber in the European theater, fewer than 0.5% per mission. What had been mocked as a flying coffin was now the safest ride a bomber crew could ask for. The irony was sharp. The plane that killed so many of its own men in training had become the guardian of those who survived. Crews who once cursed the Marauder now swore by it, painting her nose with pride, "Hot stuff, murdering Marauder, Widowmaker's revenge." For the Germans this was a psychological defeat. Every raid that cut their supply lines, every bridge that vanished, every convoy turned to twisted wreckage reinforced the truth: the Marauder was no longer a joke. It was the punctuation at the end of their sentences, the period on their grand strategy. By the time Allied troops marched north through Italy, the Luftwaffe no longer asked, "How many Marauders will fall today?" They asked, "Which of us will they kill next?" And this was just the middle act. Because soon, in the great gamble of Normandy and the liberation of France, the Marauder would shed its last shred of ridicule and become exactly what German pilots feared most: the signal that their war was over. June 6, 1944. Dawn breaks over the English Channel. The largest armada in human history begins its march toward Normandy. And above it all, the steady growl of twin radial engines, hundreds of Marauders climbing into formation. For weeks, the Germans had mocked the possibility of an Allied invasion. Hitler himself assured his generals that any attempt would be met with overwhelming force. Yet in the war rooms of the Wehrmacht, officers still sneered at the Marauder. Too clumsy. Too fragile. "The Widowmaker kills more Americans than we ever will," one Luftwaffe captain boasted. But the hours before dawn on D-Day would erase the last trace of German laughter. At 4:30 a.m., waves of Marauders descended on Normandy's coastal defenses. Unlike the lumbering high-altitude B-17s, Marauders flew in low, fast, and precise. They weren't carpet bombing, they were scalpel bombing. Bunkers disintegrated. Artillery pits vanished in plumes of dust. Bridges and crossroads critical to German reinforcements were erased before sunrise. German defenders, expecting to repel landing craft with ease, found themselves stunned. A sergeant from the 352nd Infantry Division scribbled in his diary, "The earth shook. Our guns were silent before they could fire. The sky was filled with the sound of the black coffin, but this time it carried death only for us." The Marauder had become a paradox. The machine once cursed by its crews was now the most precise instrument of destruction in the Allied arsenal. The Luftwaffe tried to respond, scrambling FW-190s to intercept the waves of bombers. But Marauders no longer flew alone. They moved in tight, disciplined groups, their overlapping fields of fire a deadly cage. German fighters who dared dive into the swarm often didn't make it out. One German ace, Oberleutnant Dieter Voss, barely escaped with his life after attacking a Marauder formation on June 7. His own words reveal the shift: "They are no longer coffins. They are fortresses and they bleed fire. I will not chase them again." The campaign in France became the Marauders' masterpiece. Day after day they hammered rail yards, bridges and supply depots with uncanny accuracy. French villagers watched in awe as bombs fell close enough to cripple German positions yet spare nearby towns. The Marauder earned a strange respect, not just from its crews but from the civilians it indirectly saved. In one mission over St. Lo, a formation of Marauders obliterated German reinforcements with a strike so exact that Allied ground commanders described it as surgery by thunder. A U.S. infantry officer later wrote, "When the Marauders cleared the sky, we advanced. It was that simple. They erased what was in front of us." For the Germans, the psychological impact was devastating. Luftwaffe pilots once bragged about easy kills. Now they dreaded the reports: Marauder strikes on Caen, Marauder strikes on Rouen, Marauder strikes on every bridge over the Seine. Reinforcements couldn't move. Supplies couldn't reach the front. Entire divisions were strangled before they ever reached battle. By late summer 1944, when Paris was liberated, the Luftwaffe's arrogance had collapsed entirely. German officers no longer joked about the Widowmaker. They whispered about der Vollstrecker, the enforcer. It was no longer just a bomber. It was the signal that Germany's time was running out. One chilling testimony came from a captured German soldier near Chartres. "When we hear the Marauder engines, we know the day belongs to the Americans. It is the end before the end." And statistically, the truth was undeniable. The Marauders' precision during the Normandy campaign was unmatched. Bridges and depots vanished with fewer bombs than any other aircraft required. Its loss rate remained the lowest of all Allied bombers in Europe. What had begun as a death trap for its own crews was now the safest and deadliest bomber in the skies. The irony was delicious and cruel. German pilots, who once mocked the Marauder as a coffin, now feared it as the herald of their own burial. Every raid was a reminder: the war they thought they could not lose was slipping from their hands, bridge by bridge, rail yard by rail yard. By the fall of 1944, the Marauder had earned its place as the executioner of German logistics. And Luftwaffe radio chatter reflected the dread. Where once came laughter, now came terse warnings: Achtung! Marauders inbound. Prepare for loss. The transformation was complete. The plane once hated by Americans and mocked by Germans had rewritten its destiny. It was no longer the Widowmaker. It was the full stop, the period, at the end of the Reich's grand sentence. But the story didn't end in France. As the Allies pressed into Germany itself, the Marauders' precision would be unleashed on the fatherland. And there, under the shadow of collapsing cities and broken armies, even the most defiant German pilots would admit the truth: the Marauder was not a joke. It was the judgment. December 1944. The German Ardennes. Snow blankets the forests, muffling the thunder of advancing panzers. Hitler has thrown his last dice in the Battle of the Bulge, hoping to split the Allies and reclaim momentum. And once again the low hum of Pratt and Whitney engines approaches, a sound that no German soldier mistakes anymore. The Marauders are coming. By now, the Marauder was no longer a subject of mockery. Luftwaffe pilots had stopped calling it the Widowmaker. Instead, they cursed it as der Henker, the hangman. Because wherever the Marauder appeared, German hopes hung by a thread. During the Ardennes offensive, German columns tried to slip through narrow valleys and forest roads. Perfect targets for Marauder formations. Flying low despite winter fog, B-26 crews unleashed pinpoint destruction. Bridges collapsed in seconds. Convoys scattered as bombs landed with chilling precision. Survivors recalled the terror: they didn't bomb the forest. They bombed the road under our boots, one Wehrmacht soldier told his interrogators. German pilots tried to intervene, but their air force was bleeding to death. Fuel shortages grounded entire squadrons. When fighters did rise, they met Marauders bristling with guns, flying tighter than ever, escorted by swarms of Mustangs. A Luftwaffe ace, Franz Kohler, later admitted, "It was not a fair fight. The Marauder was untouchable. We used to laugh. Now we prayed not to meet it." By early 1945, Marauder missions penetrated deep into Germany itself. Rail hubs in the Ruhr, bridges over the Rhine, and munitions depots across the heartland vanished under its bombs. Unlike the mass destruction of B-17 carpet raids, Marauders were scalpel strikes. They cut arteries, not limbs. Every mission crippled movement, starved divisions, and shredded the last logistics keeping the Wehrmacht alive. One of the most symbolic moments came in March 1945. Marauders targeted bridges over the Rhine near Remagen, vital for German retreat. Reports describe bombs falling so precisely that within hours, German engineers called the crossing totally unusable. Days later, when American troops seized the bridgehead, German commanders raged, "The Marauder has stolen our escape." This was the final insult. The bomber they had once derided as an American blunder was now dictating the very pace of Germany's defeat. Inside the Reich, the psychological impact was crushing. Civilians who once cheered Luftwaffe victories now stared at burning rail yards, powerless. Even propaganda could not mask the truth. Goebbels' broadcasts avoided the word Marauder, but soldiers on the ground whispered it with dread. The name itself had become a prophecy: to maraud, to destroy with ruthless efficiency. Captured Luftwaffe documents reveal a shift in tone. Where early memos mocked the Marauder, late war reports carried warnings in stark language: expect B-26 strikes. Targets will be lost. Another read simply, where the Marauder goes, the front collapses. For American crews, the irony was never forgotten. They remembered the training days when pilots cursed the plane's vicious takeoff speed, when it was a Widowmaker to its own men. Now those same crews flew with pride. Noah's Ark declared their vengeance. Widowmaker's end, the hangman's gift, final punctuation. They knew what the Germans knew: the Marauder was no longer the joke. It was the exclamation mark of victory. Statistically, the truth was undeniable. By the war's end, the Marauder had flown more than 110,000 sorties, dropping over 150,000 tons of bombs, with the best accuracy record of any medium bomber in the U.S. arsenal. Its loss rate was the lowest of all American bombers in the European theater, proof that the Widowmaker had become the safest killer in the sky. And in April 1945, as the Allies crossed into Germany's heart, Luftwaffe pilots, those who had once scoffed, now spoke with grim respect. One was overheard telling his comrades, "The Marauder is not the Widowmaker. It is our executioner." Days later, Hitler would kill himself in his Berlin bunker. The Reich would crumble. And for many German officers, the sound of twin engines overhead had already told them the truth. The war was lost not only on the ground, but in the precision of every strike that denied them retreat, resupply, or survival. The Marauder had written its own history, not in laughter, not in ridicule, but in fire and finality. From mockery to mastery, from cursed Widowmaker to Dao Cham Het for the Third Reich, it stood as proof of a bitter lesson: never underestimate what you mock. Because sometimes the last laugh belongs to the machine you feared least. When the Martin B-26 Marauder first rolled out of the Glenn L. Martin Company's factory in Baltimore in 1941, it was hailed by some as a futuristic leap in medium bombers. But within months, its reputation soured so badly that pilots christened it with one of the most chilling nicknames in aviation history: the Widowmaker. Why? Because in training, the Marauder killed its own. The design itself was radical. The B-26 had short, stubby wings attached to a large fuselage, designed to give it blistering speed compared to other bombers. But that came at a price: an extraordinarily high stall speed and dangerously fast landings. Student pilots, accustomed to more forgiving aircraft, found the Marauder merciless. Too slow on approach and it dropped like a stone. Too steep on takeoff and it flipped into disaster. In 1941-42, accident rates soared. Airfields in Florida and Louisiana earned grim reputations as Marauder graveyards. American newspapers whispered scandal. Mothers dreaded hearing their sons were assigned to a B-26 unit. Even seasoned pilots muttered in frustration. "One a day in Tampa Bay" became the cruel rhyme, referring to the number of Marauders crashing into the water during training near MacDill Field. To the Germans this was a gift. Luftwaffe intelligence picked up on the Marauders' troubles and spread the mockery. In Luftwaffe pilot circles, the Marauder wasn't feared, it was ridiculed. They called it Das Amerikanische Sargflugzeug, the American coffin plane. And from their perspective, the scorn made perfect sense. By 1942 the Luftwaffe still held formidable power. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf Fw 190 ruled the skies of Europe. German anti-aircraft defenses, flak batteries stretching from Normandy to the Ruhr, were dense and deadly. The Luftwaffe had bled the RAF during the Battle of Britain, strafed Soviet airfields in Operation Barbarossa, and humbled entire nations under the scream of Stukas. Against this backdrop, the Americans were latecomers. The United States had entered the war after Pearl Harbor, and its air arm was still learning how to fight in the European theater. To German eyes, the Marauder was not just a flawed bomber, it was an emblem of American naivety, a clumsy experiment sent to die against seasoned killers. And in truth, for its first months, the ridicule was justified. Marauders went down not just in training but in their initial missions. Their short wings punished inexperienced crews. Fuel consumption was high. Landing strips had to be longer and smoother, which in war zones was not always possible. For Luftwaffe commanders it was laughable. The Americans had built a plane that killed its own more effectively than the enemy could. But here is where history twisted. When the Marauder finally entered combat in 1942, something unexpected happened. Despite its brutal learning curve, the aircraft revealed a hidden gift: accuracy. Unlike high-altitude bombers that blanketed wide areas, the Marauder could deliver its payload with startling precision. In rail yards, bombs fell directly on the junction. On bridges, they struck spans with uncanny regularity. When crews learned to master its quirks, the Marauder transformed from liability to lethal instrument. German officers, reviewing reports from France and the Low Countries, began noticing a pattern. Yes, Marauders were lost. But the ones that survived inflicted damage far out of proportion to their numbers. Rail lines crucial for moving supplies to the Eastern Front were severed again and again. Fuel depots in Sicily erupted in infernos that delayed panzer movements for days. Even hardened Luftwaffe veterans, men who had sneered at the Widowmaker, admitted privately that the Marauder was no longer a joke. One revealing line came from a German colonel after a raid on Naples in late 1943. "We mock their plane, but it hits our bridges as if it sees them through a gun sight. I would rather fight 10 fortresses than one Marauder formation." The shift in perception was slow but inexorable. At first, laughter filled Luftwaffe mess halls. Tales of Marauders plummeting on takeoff, jokes about American engineers designing suicide machines. But after Sicily, after Normandy, after the relentless strikes that paralyzed German logistics, the tone changed. No one laughed anymore. Instead, they muttered warnings: Marauders inbound. Expect precision. Expect loss. By 1944, when the Allies stormed France, the Marauder had become the sharpest blade in the American bomber arsenal. Its loss rate was the lowest of any U.S. bomber in Europe. Its accuracy was the highest. What began as a flying coffin was reborn as the scalpel that carved apart the Reich's arteries. And this reversal, mockery turned into fear, is what makes the story of the Marauder cinematic. The Germans were not wrong to scorn it at first. They had reason, both in its bloody training record and in their own air supremacy. But the Marauder's transformation proved a lesson they never expected. The weapon you underestimate may become the one that ends you. As Allied generals later said, the Marauder did not just bomb Germany. It buried German arrogance. This is the central problem, and the central irony. The very plane cursed by its own men, mocked by its enemies, became the quiet executioner of the Third Reich's ambitions. To understand why the Marauder was first despised and then revered, you have to look under its skin, into the mechanics that terrified its own pilots yet later terrified the Germans. At first glance, the B-26 was a paradox. It was faster than any bomber of its class, capable of cruising at over 280 miles per hour and diving past 315. For context, the Luftwaffe's famed Ju-88 bomber, considered versatile and deadly, struggled to match 280 on a good day. In theory, this gave the Marauder the ability to outrun interceptors after releasing bombs. In practice, it was unforgiving. The short wingspan, just 71 feet compared to the Ju-88-65 but with far greater fuselage weight, meant that its wing loading was brutal. Pilots who transitioned from trainers felt betrayed. The Marauder demanded landing speeds around 120 to 130 miles per hour, while other medium bombers could settle comfortably under 100. That margin was everything. A second of hesitation, a gust of wind, and the Widowmaker earned its name. German intelligence knew these numbers. They scoffed at them. Too fast to land, too heavy to climb, too dangerous for its own, Luftwaffe reports claimed. And they weren't wrong. On training airfields, it was disaster after disaster. By early 1942, accident rates reached levels that made American newspapers question whether the program should be canceled outright. Yet in combat, that same speed turned poison into medicine. When Marauders swept into occupied France at treetop level, their velocity shocked anti-aircraft crews. German gunners, calibrated for slower bombers like the B-17 at altitude or lumbering Stukas in dives, found their aim lagging behind the Marauders' rush. Even pilots of the fast Bf-109 complained. To intercept a formation, they had to dive from above and commit to a pass. But Marauders, once lightened of bombs, could dash away at nearly the same pace as a fighter burdened with cannon. This was the first cruel twist of engineering. What killed Marauder rookies in Florida saved veterans over France. But speed alone didn't make it accurate. That came from the Norden bomb sight, an optical marvel that promised pinpoint strikes when used correctly. High-altitude bombers used it too, but Marauders flew lower where winds mattered less. The result was shocking precision. Bridges fell in single runs. Fuel depots were erased without carpet bombing. Germans who expected the indiscriminate destruction of four-engine raids now faced something more unnerving: the scalpel instead of the hammer. A Luftwaffe colonel bitterly admitted after Sicily, "The fortress spreads terror. The Marauder spreads certainty. Where it flies, something will vanish." There was another element: defense. While lighter than a B-17, the Marauder bristled with up to 12.50 caliber Browning M2s. Nose, tail, waist, dorsal, ventral, all angles covered. In formation, these fields overlapped, creating a deadly sphere. Luftwaffe pilots discovered this the hard way. Diving in on what they thought was an easy kill, they were met with intersecting curtains of tracers. An FW-190 could slice through a lone bomber, but against a box of Marauders, its chances dropped sharply. The numbers again tell the irony. Early training accidents gave the Marauder a reputation for slaughter. But by 1943-44 in actual combat, its loss rate fell below 0.5% per mission, the lowest of any American bomber. For comparison, B-17 crews dreaded loss rates of 2 to 3%, sometimes higher in raids over Germany. The very plane cursed by its own men had become the safest to fly once mastered. And this was the second cruel twist. Statistics that once condemned the Marauder became its redemption. Of course, to the Germans, this transformation felt like betrayal of their own arrogance. They had every reason to sneer. They flew elegant machines, the Me-109 agile and deadly, the FW-190, a butcher's blade in the sky. Against such predators, what chance did a clumsy American medium bomber stand? For a while the answer was none. But as Marauder groups hardened, what Luftwaffe pilots once considered prey began shooting back, flying faster than expected and, worst of all, hitting exactly what mattered. This was not just technology. It was adaptation. American crews learned to fly the Marauder not as a liability but as a weapon with quirks. They took the numbers the Germans mocked, its landing speeds, its wing loading, its unforgiving handling, and turned them into a profile the Luftwaffe dreaded. A bomber that was hard to hit, hard to catch, and almost impossible to ignore. By 1944, Luftwaffe pilots no longer laughed at the Widowmaker. They cursed its accuracy, its speed, its formations, its sting. And above all, they cursed the cruelest irony of all. The very flaws that once threatened American lives had become the traits that ended German ones. If speed was the Marauder's first cruel gift, then power was its second. Under its stubby wings roared two Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engines, each pumping out over 2,000 horsepower. These were the same engines that drove the F-6F Hellcat and the P-47 Thunderbolt, fighters known for raw muscle. But on the Marauder, they were strapped to a bomber's body. The result? A beast that could climb and sprint faster than any German expected. For comparison, the Luftwaffe's Ju-88, a workhorse medium bomber, lugged along with Jumo engines producing barely 1,200 horsepower each. Even the sleeker Dornier Du-217 couldn't match the Marauder's thrust. On paper, that difference looked like excess weight carried by the Americans. In the air, it meant Marauders could power through flak zones and race away from interceptors once lightened of bombs. German pilots who once rolled their eyes at the Widowmaker now gritted their teeth, muttering, Zu schnell für ein Ziel. Too fast for a target. Bomb load told another story. The Marauder carried up to 4,000 pounds of bombs, less than the B-17 Flying Fortress, which could haul over 8,000 on long missions. To the Germans that looked like weakness. Fewer bombs meant less destruction, fewer craters. But that calculation missed the point. The Marauder wasn't designed to flatten cities. It was designed to sever arteries. 4,000 pounds delivered with uncanny precision could destroy a bridge, erase a fuel dump, or gut a rail junction. And because it carried fewer bombs, it didn't have to climb as high or lumber as slowly. It struck fast, struck true, and vanished. Where the B-17 hammered, the Marauder carved. German officers learned this distinction the hard way. When B-17s hit Hamburg, destruction was widespread, horrifying, but often scattered. When Marauders hit bridges near Cannes or Nancy, the structures simply disappeared, one after another, choking German mobility. A Wehrmacht engineer recalled bitterly, "We filled the craters of Hamburg. But when the Marauder dropped a bridge, we could not rebuild it before the next morning. They cut our veins open." Range was another subtle irony. The Marauder could fly about 1,100 miles, shorter than the B-24 Liberator, which boasted nearly 2,000. Luftwaffe officers mocked this. They called it the short-legged bomber, claiming it could never reach the Reich's heart. But in Europe's compressed geography, range wasn't everything. What mattered was reliability over the Channel, Sicily, and France. The Marauder didn't need to bomb Berlin, it needed to bomb every bridge, every supply yard, every crossing that fed German armies in the West. And in that role, its so-called short legs carried it exactly where it needed to go. Even its reputation for toughness surprised its enemies. While not as armored as the Flying Fortress, Marauders returned home riddled with holes that should have killed them. Crews told stories of limping back on one engine, hydraulics shredded, fuel leaking, yet somehow making it across the channel. German pilots scoffed, until they saw Marauders they swore had been mortally hit still spewing fire from their guns as they turned for home. Here again comparison sharpened the point. The Luftwaffe's Heinkel He-111, once the pride of Blitz raids over London, was now obsolete, slow, undergunned, and fragile. The Do-217, though versatile, lacked the survivability of Marauders in tight formation. Even the feared Ju-88, which had begun the war as a terror, looked increasingly dated when confronted with swarms of fast, bristling B-20s. By 1944, German crews admitted privately that the Marauder was the hardest medium bomber to fight. Not because it carried the most bombs, not because it had the longest legs, but because it combined speed, power, and precision into something greater than the sum of its parts. And the numbers sealed the verdict. The Marauder's loss rate, once scandalous in training, plummeted to the lowest in the European theater. Less than 0.5% of sorties ended in destruction. By comparison, the Luftwaffe's own bomber losses on the Eastern Front often exceeded 5% per raid. The Widowmaker had become the survivor. The Germans could no longer rationalize their contempt. They had laughed at its short wings, mocked its landings, dismissed its limited payload. But each of those flaws had transformed into advantages in combat. Short wings gave speed. Speed made accuracy possible. Smaller loads meant sharper cuts. Lower altitude meant bombs that landed exactly where they were meant to. It was engineering irony at its most brutal. The Marauders' design quirks, once a liability, became a weapon that outclassed Germany's own medium bombers. And so the Marauder carried with it not just bombs but symbolism. It was proof that arrogance blinds. That the Luftwaffe, so confident in its Messerschmitts and its victories, had underestimated the wrong machine. By the end of 1944, German soldiers no longer pointed at the Marauder and laughed. They pointed and they ducked, knowing that whatever it aimed at would not survive the morning. The Widowmaker was gone. In its place flew a different title, whispered even by its enemies, the most precise executioner of the war. The Marauder story is not just about an aircraft, it is about perception, arrogance, and the cruel math of war. The Luftwaffe's contempt for the B-26 in 1942 seemed logical. They saw the headlines of American accidents, the grim rhyme, one a day in Tampa Bay. They read intelligence reports about its high stall speeds, its dangerous landings, its limited bomb load. To German eyes this was not a weapon, it was a self-inflicted wound. And compared to their own arsenal the arrogance made sense. The Luftwaffe had the Junkers Ju-88, the Swiss Army knife of German bombers, fast enough to escape interceptors, versatile enough to serve as bomber, night fighter, even torpedo carrier. They had the Dornier Do-217, a long-range bomber capable of striking Britain and Soviet rail hubs. The Heinkel He-111, though aging, had once terrorized London during the Blitz. And of course their tactical jewel, the Ju-87 Stuka, had screamed across Europe in precision dive bombing runs, breaking Polish columns, French fortifications and Soviet morale. Against this backdrop, the Marauder looked laughable. It carried half the bombs of a flying fortress. It lacked the psychological terror of a Stuka's dive siren. It had none of the glamour of the Ju-88. It was, to German eyes, an overweight, short-legged, clumsy machine with wings too small to keep itself in the air. That was their first mistake, judging the Marauder by what it was in training, not by what it would become in war. Because unlike the Luftwaffe, the Americans built for endurance. They didn't need terror weapons like the Stuka, which by 1942 was already bleeding under Soviet skies, hopeless against modern fighters. They didn't need versatile hybrids like the Ju-88, stretched thin across too many roles. They needed specialization. And the Marauder specialized in one thing: precision destruction. Let's take bridges as the perfect case study. German strategy relied heavily on rapid maneuver, on railways to shift divisions from east to west, on bridges to feed armor across rivers. In the early years, the Stuka excelled at smashing bridges and tactical raids. But by 1943, Stukas were falling from the sky in droves, easy prey to Allied fighters. The Luftwaffe's medium bombers could try, but their accuracy was nowhere near what the Marauder achieved with the Norden bomb sight at low altitudes. So while the Luftwaffe still laughed, American crews were already cutting German arteries with surgical strikes. A single Marauder formation could deny an entire Panzer Corps mobility, not through terror, not through mass destruction, but through the cold mathematics of precision. Here lay the second German mistake, believing that bigger loads and longer ranges defined power. The Heinkel He-111 could carry a payload similar to the Marauders, but it was slower, less maneuverable, and woefully underarmed by 1943. The Ju-88, though faster, carried lighter defensive armament and was increasingly vulnerable. German bombers could no longer penetrate Allied skies with impunity, while Marauders, escorted and bristling with machine guns, shredded interceptors that dared attack. Meanwhile, the B-17 and B-24, America's heavy bombers, dropped mountains of bombs from high altitude. They were hammers. But the Marauder was the scalpel. Together, they created a strategy the Luftwaffe could not counter. Hammer cities into submission, then cut off supplies with surgical strikes. The Germans never adapted. Their doctrine was built for short, decisive campaigns, shock and collapse. They hadn't prepared for a grinding, industrial air war. By the time Marauders appeared in force, Germany lacked the resources, fuel and replacement pilots to adjust. One Luftwaffe general admitted after the war, "We laughed at the Marauder because it killed Americans in Florida. We forgot that a machine can be tamed. We forgot that precision is deadlier than terror. And so the Marauder became our hangman." The irony was cruel. German pilots had once dismissed the Marauder as a flying coffin. But by 1944, Luftwaffe radio chatter told a different story. No more laughter. Just fear, Marauders inbound. Expect bridges gone. Expect convoys cut. Expect loss. And therein lies the historical lesson. The Marauders' victory wasn't just in tons of bombs dropped or sorties flown. It was in how it turned German arrogance against itself. The Luftwaffe wasted time mocking a machine that was quietly evolving into the weapon that would strangle them. The comparison speaks for itself. The Ju-87 Stuka, once the terror of Europe, was obsolete by 1943, shot down in droves. The Ju-88, versatile but overstretched, lacked the accuracy for precision strikes. The He-111, once the Blitz's spear, became a lumbering relic. The Marauder, cursed by its own side, became the most accurate bomber in Europe. Germany's mistake was not just tactical, it was psychological. They underestimated the plane that would become their undoing. They thought the Widowmaker killed only Americans. They were wrong. It killed the Reich. When the dust of Europe's battlefields finally settled in 1945, there were countless wrecks of German armor, burnt rail cars, and collapsed bridges littering the landscape. But ask a German soldier what haunted him most from the sky, and his answer was often not the mighty flying fortress or the terrifying carpet raids. It was the Marauder. Because the Marauder's legacy was not measured in the tonnage of destruction, it was measured in the precision of collapse. For the Wehrmacht, logistics had always been lifeblood. German armies thrived on speed and maneuver, the famed blitzkrieg doctrine that had toppled Poland and France. But by 1943–44, every artery of that system came under attack. Rail hubs once bustling with supplies went silent. Bridges once crowded with convoys vanished into rivers. Fuel depots erupted into infernos before tanks could refuel. And again, when survivors looked up to curse the culprit, they saw the blunt nose and twin engines of the Marauder. This was the weapon that starved the Reich. The impact was cumulative. A destroyed bridge didn't just inconvenience a regiment, it delayed an entire corps. A severed rail line forced fuel and ammunition to be rerouted over longer, more vulnerable roads. A precision strike on a marshalling yard could paralyze troop movements for days. Unlike high-altitude bombing campaigns, which left widespread but often patchy damage, Marauder raids cut with surgical efficiency. The Germans called it die Nadelstick, the needle stabs. Each small, precise wound bled them dry. The long-term consequence was devastating. By the time of the Normandy invasion, German divisions in France often lacked ammunition, fuel, or reinforcements not because they didn't exist, but because they couldn't move. Marauders had turned France into a maze of broken arteries. Even German generals admitted it. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who had fought in Italy, told interrogators after the war, "The Americans' medium bomber, the Marauder, was the true executioner of our bridges. It did not bomb like a hammer, it cut like a scalpel. We could never match its accuracy." For the Allies, the Marauder taught another lesson: safety and precision could coexist. By 1944, the B-26 had the lowest loss rate of any Allied bomber in Europe. Pilots who had once cursed it now praised it as their best chance of survival. Veterans who survived the war often said, "If you had to go to Germany, you wanted to go in a Marauder." That change rippled into post-war thinking. The notion that a medium bomber could outshine heavies in accuracy reshaped American doctrine. After the war, the U.S. Air Force leaned harder into the concept of tactical precision bombing, strikes designed to cripple infrastructure rather than terrorize populations. In Korea, in Vietnam, and eventually in the Gulf, the DNA of the Marauder's philosophy lived on. But perhaps the deepest impact was psychological. The Luftwaffe, so proud of its early war dominance, learned humility the hard way. They had mocked the Marauder as a suicide machine. Yet by 1945, it was their nightmare, proof that arrogance blinds. Many German memoirs after the war contain a kind of bitter respect for the B-26. They called it Der Vollstrecker, the enforcer, or more grimly, Der Henker, the hangman. The irony still resonates today. The Marauder never carried the fame of the B-17. It never symbolized America's air war like the Flying Fortress, nor carried the scale of destruction of the Liberator. But ask historians who study accuracy, and they point to the Marauder as the quiet legend. The numbers don't lie. 110,000 sorties, 150,000 tons of bombs, the lowest casualty rate of any U.S. bomber in Europe, and the highest strike precision. Its long-term consequence was not just the fall of bridges or the starvation of German divisions. It was a shift in how war itself was imagined. That precision mattered more than brute force. That survival mattered as much as destruction. And that a machine once cursed could redefine an entire doctrine. Even culturally, the Marauder's redemption became a story of perseverance. In American squadrons, young men who once begged not to fly it later refused to leave it. They painted her with nose art not mocking death but celebrating survival, Widowmaker's revenge, the sure thing, hot stuff. These names carried pride not fear. And the Luftwaffe's cultural memory bore scars too. Where they once laughed at American machines, by 1945 they dreaded the low rumble of twin engines. Marauder raids became shorthand for inevitability. If the Marauders had found your bridge, you could pack up and go home, it would not stand tomorrow. Long after the war, aviation historians continued to revisit the Marauder's paradox. A plane almost cancelled in disgrace became one of the most efficient tools of Allied victory. It became a warning to engineers, pilots, and strategists alike: never underestimate a design's potential. And never mistake early tragedy for permanent failure. The Marauder's ultimate impact was not just that it killed Germans or destroyed infrastructure. It was that it humbled both sides. It humbled the Americans, who learned that skill and adaptation could tame a beast. It humbled the Germans, who learned that mockery could blind them to danger. And it humbled history, forcing us to see that the machines most hated at birth can become the legends most respected in hindsight. When Allied troops crossed the Rhine in March 1945, one officer remarked that the river crossings were not just won on the ground. They had been prepared weeks earlier, every time a Marauder dropped its payload onto a bridge, a depot, or a junction. Victory had been carved from the sky, stroke by stroke, until Germany had nothing left to give. And so, when we speak of long-term impact, we are not just speaking of tactics or statistics. We are speaking of a machine that embodied a paradox. The Widowmaker that saved lives, the joke that became judgment, the bomber that buried arrogance under its precision. The Marauder's story did not end in 1945. Its lessons still echo in every debate about precision versus saturation, about survivability versus firepower. And in that sense, every modern strike fighter and bomber owes something to the machine once mocked as a coffin. The Germans were right to laugh in 1942. And they were right to stop laughing by 1945. Because the Marauder did not just survive history, it rewrote it. The Martin B-26 Marauder's story reads like a cruel joke at first. A bomber that killed its own crews in training, a machine scorned by the very men ordered to fly it, and an embarrassment seized upon by the Luftwaffe as proof of American incompetence. In 1942, it was the punchline. By 1945, it was the period, the full stop, at the end of the Reich. What transformed the Widowmaker into the most accurate bomber of the war was not just engineering, though its speed, power, and firepower played their roles. It was human resilience. Crews who refused to surrender to statistics. Commanders who refused to cancel a flawed design. And missions that proved, raid after raid, that precision could win wars more efficiently than terror or brute force. The Germans had reason to laugh. They had seen American pilots die in training, seen the Marauder stumble through its first missions. But their arrogance blinded them. They underestimated what adaptation could achieve. And when the Marauder found its rhythm, its scars became its strength. Short wings became speed. Speed became accuracy. Accuracy became inevitability. The lesson is timeless. Technology can deceive. Early failures can disguise future triumphs. Arrogance can turn victory into defeat. And sometimes, the weapon you mock most loudly is the one that buries you most quietly. In every burned rail yard, every shattered bridge, every crippled convoy, the Marauder left its mark not just in steel and smoke but in psychology. Luftwaffe pilots who once jeered fell silent. Ground troops who once cheered down bombers now prayed they wouldn't hear that low growl overhead. The Marauder didn't terrorize like the Stuka, didn't overwhelm like the Fortress, it executed. With precision. With finality. And that is why its story matters today. Because the Marauder is more than an airplane. It is a parable of war, of hubris undone by persistence. It reminds us that in history as in life, the loudest laughter can mask the deepest fear, and the greatest victories can come from the most unlikely beginnings. So as you picture those German pilots in 1942, laughing over their radios, calling the B-26 a flying coffin, remember the silence of 1945 when they no longer laughed, when the sound of twin radials in the distance meant the end of another bridge, another supply line, another dream of victory. That is the Marauder's legacy. Not just the most accurate bomber of World War II, but the executioner of German arrogance. If you've stayed with me through this journey, from mockery to mastery, from Widowmaker to war winner, then you know how much history hides in the machines we forget. And this channel is here to unearth those stories, one by one, in all their cinematic detail. So if you want more tales like this, of weapons, of men, of myths stripped bare, hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, and join us. Because the Marauder's story is just one of many, and together we'll keep opening history's black box, revealing the machines that didn't just fly but changed the world.